Nimra learned early that disappearance does not always come with noise. Sometimes it arrives quietly, wrapped in routine, disguised as necessity. At 16, she did not understand abandonment as an act. She understood it as absence. An empty chair. A door that closed without explanation. A future that suddenly expected her to grow up faster than her heart could manage. Her mother did not leave dramatically. There were no final words that Nimra could replay for clarity, no emotional explosion that would justify the pain. There was only a decision made somewhere else, for reasons Nimra was never invited to understand. One day she was a daughter. The next she was a responsibility set aside. The world did not pause for her confusion. School continued. Bills existed. Hunger arrived on schedule. And Nimra learned that grief, when unsupported, does not look like sadness. It looks like adaptation. It looks like silence. It looks like learning how to carry yourself so no one asks what you're missing. She did not cry often. Not because she was strong, but because crying required safety. And safety was no longer guaranteed. She learned how to pack her emotions neatly, the same way she packed her belongings when she was told she could not stay anymore. With care. With restraint. With a quiet hope that this was temporary. But temporary stretched into years. Nimra became invisible in the way abandoned children often do. Not unseen, but unconsidered. She existed in the margins of other people's lives, tolerated rather than supported. She learned to ask for very little because asking reminded her of what she no longer had. Her uncle knew. He had known when she was left. He had known when she struggled. He had known when silence replaced childhood. But knowing and intervening are different things. He chose distance. He chose comfort. He chose not to complicate his life with someone else's loss. And so Nimra learned another lesson. Love that watches suffering without moving is not love at all. Years passed, and Nimra survived them without ceremony. She worked when she could. She studied when exhaustion allowed. She grew into independence not because she wanted to, but because she had no alternative. The absence of family shaped her more than their presence ever had. She did not become bitter. She became careful. Careful with trust. Careful with hope. Careful with expectations. She learned how to be self-contained, how to rely on consistency rather than affection. She built a life that did not collapse if someone walked away. Her mother became a quiet shadow in her memory. Not a villain, not a hero. Just a woman who chose differently. Nimra stopped asking why. Answers did not change outcomes. Family gatherings stopped including her name. Her existence faded into background knowledge. Something that had happened, not something that continued. Until it did. The call about her uncle's death arrived without warning. It disrupted a life that had finally found its rhythm. Nimra listened without reaction, absorbing information the way she had learned to absorb everything else. There was no grief. Only awareness. The invitation to the inheritance reading felt surreal. Not because of the money, but because it required her presence in a story she had been written out of long ago. A room full of people who had not shown up when it mattered now expected her to sit quietly while decisions were made. Nimra did not attend with expectation. She attended with memory. She remembered who had been absent. She remembered who had stayed silent. She remembered the cost of being left behind. What she did not know was that this moment would force the past to speak. That the silence she had lived inside for years was about to crack. That the people who once demanded nothing from her were about to demand everything. And that the girl everyone forgot had grown into someone they could no longer ignore. The night Nimra was left behind did not feel like an ending. It felt unfinished, like a sentence cut off halfway through. At 16, she still believed that adults explained things eventually. That silence was temporary. That someone would come back and make it make sense. Her mother packed lightly. Not the kind of packing that suggested travel or hope, but the kind that suggested escape. Nimra noticed the details before she understood the meaning. The absence of hesitation. The calm movements. The way her mother avoided her eyes, as if eye contact might slow her down. Nothing was said directly. There were no instructions, no promises, no reassurance that this was temporary. Just vague urgency wrapped in responsibility, as if Nimra were old enough to understand decisions she had no power over. When the door closed, it did not slam. It clicked. That sound stayed with her longer than any words could have. Hours passed before reality arrived. Nimra sat where she had been left, replaying the moment, waiting for footsteps that never came. She did not panic. Panic requires certainty. What she felt was confusion, so heavy it pressed the air out of her lungs. By morning, the house felt different. Not emptier, stranger. Every object seemed to ask a question. Why are you still here? What happens now? Who takes care of you when the person meant to does not return? Nimra moved through the day carefully, as if sudden motion might shatter what little stability remained. She made food she barely ate. She cleaned spaces that were already clean. She kept busy because stillness forced her to think. Days turned into weeks. No explanation arrived. Her phone stayed silent. Messages went unanswered. Calls rang until they stopped. Nimra learned that being ignored hurts more than being told no. At least no carries intention. Silence carries abandonment without accountability. Relatives knew. They always know. But knowing did not translate into action. Offers came wrapped in inconvenience. Temporary solutions. Conditional kindness. The kind that reminds you constantly that you are a burden, not a priority. Eventually, she was told she could not stay. Not because she had done anything wrong, but because no one wanted responsibility that did not belong to them. Nimra packed her life into bags that felt too small for 16 years of existence. Childhood reduced to essentials. She did not cry when she left. She did not look back. Something inside her understood that longing for people who chose absence was a losing game. She stayed where she was allowed, not where she was loved. She learned to read rooms quickly, to sense when she was overstaying her welcome. Gratitude became her armor. Silence became her language. School became survival. She studied not for dreams, but for escape. Each exam passed felt like one step further away from the girl who had been left behind. She did not talk about her mother. Not because she did not feel the loss, but because explaining it required vulnerability, and vulnerability required trust. Trust was expensive. Her uncle watched from a distance. He saw her struggle, heard about her situation, understood the weight she carried. But involvement would have required effort. And effort would have required empathy. He chose distance instead, convincing himself that staying uninvolved was neutrality, not neglect. Years passed quietly. Nimra grew into a version of herself shaped by necessity. She learned how to live without expecting rescue. She learned that survival did not need permission. She learned that being strong was not a choice, it was a requirement. The girl who had once waited by the door stopped waiting. She stopped believing that people returned just because they were supposed to. And in doing so, she unknowingly prepared herself for a future where those same people would return, not with apologies, but with demands. Because abandonment does not erase entitlement. It only delays it. Nimra learned early that survival was quieter than people imagined. It was not dramatic or heroic. It was waking up every day and choosing to continue, even when nothing waited for her on the other side of effort. She moved from place to place in those years, never staying long enough to feel settled. Each home came with unspoken rules. Be grateful. Be invisible. Do not take up space. Do not remind them that you are not supposed to be here. She followed those rules well. Too well. Her belongings stayed packed even when she unpacked them. A habit formed from never knowing when she would be asked to leave again. Stability felt suspicious, like something that could disappear if she trusted it too much. School became the only place where she could exist without apologizing. There, she was not someone's responsibility or inconvenience. She was just another student, another name on a list. That anonymity felt like freedom. She stayed late after classes, using libraries and empty classrooms as shelter from uncertainty. Knowledge gave her control when nothing else did. Grades were measurable. Effort mattered. Outcomes made sense. Life outside did not. Her mother remained absent. Not even a shadow. Nimra stopped checking her phone. Hope had become a form of self-harm. Accepting abandonment hurt less than expecting love that never arrived. The uncle existed at the edges of her life. Holidays. Occasional check-ins. Distant concern that required no action. He spoke of family values while maintaining emotional distance, convincing himself that watching from afar counted as care. It did not. When Nimra turned 18, expectations changed overnight. Sympathy expired. Support became optional. She was suddenly old enough to handle everything alone, as if pain followed age limits. She took work where she could find it. Small jobs. Long hours. Fatigue became familiar, but so did independence. Every paycheck, no matter how small, felt like proof that she could rely on herself. She learned to budget not just money but energy. She learned which battles were worth fighting and which silences protected her peace. She learned that dignity often meant walking away without explanation. Loneliness followed her, but it did not define her. What defined her was endurance. Years passed without ceremony. No one celebrated how far she had come. No one acknowledged what she had survived. But survival does not ask for applause. It simply continues. By her early 20s, Nimra had built a life that looked modest from the outside but felt monumental to her. A place of her own. A routine. A future that belonged to her, not borrowed from anyone else's permission. She believed the hardest part was behind her. She believed the past had finally loosened its grip. She did not know that silence has a way of returning, not to heal, but to collect. Because the people who disappear when you need them often reappear when they want something. And Nimra's name was about to be spoken again in rooms she had never been invited into. The invitation arrived without warning, slipped into Nimra's ordinary life like it belonged there. An envelope among bills and notices, formal in tone, impersonal in language. Her name printed cleanly, as if it had always been welcome in official spaces. She stared at it longer than necessary. Her uncle's name was there. So was a date. So was a location tied to memories she had learned not to touch. An inheritance reading. The words felt heavy, carrying implications she did not want to unpack. She had no expectations. None at all. She had learned the danger of assuming fairness from people who had never shown it. Still, something inside her shifted. Not hope, curiosity. The past had a way of demanding acknowledgement, whether one was ready or not. In the days leading up to the reading, old emotions surfaced quietly. Not in waves, but in fragments. Thoughts she thought she had resolved returned without permission. Questions she had buried knocked gently, insistently. Why now? Why her? Why after so many years of silence? She almost did not go. Walking away would have been easy. She had practiced distance her entire adult life. But something told her this moment mattered, even if she did not yet understand why. The building was grand in the way that money tends to be, clean, cold, confident. It made no effort to be welcoming. It did not need to. People came to it for answers, not comfort. Nimra arrived alone. She always did. Inside, familiar faces appeared unfamiliar. Relatives who had watched her struggle from afar now gathered with quiet entitlement. Their presence filled the room with tension, unspoken calculations, silent assumptions. She noticed how quickly eyes flickered in her direction. Recognition without warmth. Curiosity without concern. She took a seat away from them. She had learned how to exist on the edges. The reading began with formalities, names, assets, language stripped of emotion. Nimra listened without attachment. She did not come for validation. She did not come for forgiveness. She came because she had been summoned. Then her name was mentioned. Not casually. Intentionally. The room shifted. Attention focused. Suddenly, her existence mattered. She felt it in the way bodies leaned forward, in the way silence sharpened. She was no longer invisible. She was relevant. And relevance made people uncomfortable. The document spoke of provisions, of considerations made long before illness had taken everything else, of decisions written with clarity and intent. Nimra did not react. She had learned that stillness was power. But around her, tension grew. Because what had been assumed was no longer certain. Because the past was asserting itself in ink and signature. Because the girl who had been left behind was no longer a footnote. The reading ended, but nothing felt finished. This was not closure. This was the beginning of something unfinished finally demanding resolution. And Nimra, who had survived by expecting nothing, was about to learn what people do when entitlement meets reality. The room changed the moment the reading ended. What had felt formal turned personal. What had felt distant turned sharp. Nimra sensed it before anyone moved, before anyone spoke. Entitlement has a presence. It announces itself without words. Relatives who had not reached out in years suddenly found reasons to stand closer. Their expressions carried calculation, not concern. They did not look at her as family. They looked at her as an obstacle. She remained seated. Stillness had become her instinct. The details of the inheritance circulated quietly among them, whispered interpretations replacing legal language. Assumptions surfaced quickly. That she would not understand. That she would not fight. That she would accept whatever version of reality they presented. They had not watched her grow up without a safety net. They had not seen the years where no one showed up for her. They underestimated her because they had forgotten her. Her uncle avoided her gaze. He had known this moment would come. He had known the document existed. The discomfort he wore now was not surprise. It was guilt arriving too late to be useful. Nimra noticed the shift in how she was addressed. Politeness replaced indifference. Interest replaced absence. It was not subtle. It was transactional. She left the building with a heaviness she could not name. Not because of what she had gained, but because of what had been revealed. Love, she realized, was never what had kept her out of family circles. Convenience was. Over the next days, communication poured in. Messages. Calls. Carefully worded check-ins pretending to be concern. Each one carried the same undertone. Expectations disguised as reconnection. They spoke of unity. They spoke of fairness. They spoke of what was deserved. Nimra listened without responding. She had learned that people reveal themselves most honestly when they think they are winning. She met with a lawyer quietly, privately. Not because she wanted conflict, but because she wanted clarity. Her life had taught her the cost of ignorance. The documents were reviewed carefully. Every clause. Every signature, every intention preserved in writing. There was no ambiguity. The will had been deliberate. Her uncle had not expected it to be honored this fully. The family had assumed influence would outweigh ink. They were wrong. The pressure increased as understanding spread. Subtle threats followed polite requests. Emotional appeals arrived wrapped in nostalgia that had never included her. She felt the weight of being alone again. But this time it was different. This time, she was not powerless. The girl who had once been abandoned now stood at the center of a storm created by other people's expectations. And she would not disappear to make them comfortable. Because survival had taught her something they never learned. You do not owe access to the people who ignored your absence. The shift did not happen all at once. It unfolded gradually, like pressure building behind a wall no one bothered to reinforce. What began as polite curiosity transformed into expectation, and expectation hardened into demand. Nimra watched it happen with a strange calm, as if observing a storm from behind glass. At first, it was concern disguised as care. People who had not asked about her well-being for years suddenly wanted updates. They wanted to know how she was coping, whether she was overwhelmed, whether she needed guidance. The irony was sharp enough to cut, but Nimra did not react. She had learned that reacting gave people control. Then came the reminders of family. Shared bloodlines were suddenly important. Memories were selectively recalled, edited to fit a narrative where Nimra had always belonged, always been supported, always been part of something larger. The past was rewritten with impressive confidence. But Nimra remembered the truth too clearly to be swayed. She remembered being 16 and unwanted. She remembered being tolerated rather than protected. She remembered learning independence not as ambition, but as survival. Those years had carved something solid inside her, something that did not bend easily. As clarity spread about the inheritance, the tone shifted again. Subtle urgency entered the conversations. There were hints of obligation, of responsibility, of what she should do now that she had been included. They spoke as if her inclusion were a gift rather than a correction. They spoke as if she owed gratitude for being acknowledged. Nimra did not correct them. She listened. She noticed patterns. Who reached out first? Who waited until others had tried and failed? Who framed their interest as concern for her and who framed it as concern for the family's future? The words changed, but the intent remained the same. Money was never the subject directly. It did not need to be. It hovered beneath every sentence, every pause, every carefully placed emphasis. It existed in the questions about her plans, her needs, her intentions. It was implied that she did not deserve to decide alone. The pressure intensified when boundaries were not immediately crossed. Her silence unsettled them. They were used to resistance or compliance, not restraint. Nimra's refusal to explain herself created space they could not control, and people who rely on entitlement do not handle uncertainty well. The uncle tried a different approach. His presence grew heavier, more persistent. Not forceful, but deliberate. He framed himself as a guide, someone who understood the complexities she could not possibly grasp alone. He positioned experience as authority, forgetting that experience without integrity carries little weight. Nimra noticed how responsibility was redirected, how choices he had made were softened, excused, reframed, how his absence during her most vulnerable years was acknowledged only as distance, never neglect. She felt no urge to confront him. Confrontation suggests expectation of change. She expected none. Instead, she focused on understanding the structure of what surrounded her. Legal documents, timelines, intentions preserved on paper. The will was not emotional. It was precise. It did not apologize. It did not explain. It simply stated. That clarity felt like a form of protection she had never been offered in life. As demands became clearer, so did the desperation behind them. They needed access. They needed influence. They needed her cooperation to reshape outcomes they had assumed were already theirs. They underestimated the quiet strength that comes from having nothing to lose. Nimra had built her life without safety nets, without inheritance, without reassurance. This was not the foundation of her identity. It was an unexpected addition. She did not depend on it for survival, and that made her dangerous to people who relied on leverage. The emotional manipulation escalated when persuasion failed. Guilt replaced reason. Responsibility replaced choice. They spoke of unity as if it had ever included her, of sacrifice as if it had ever been shared equally. They did not understand that Nimra's resilience had been forged in isolation. She had survived without them. She could stand against them too. What surprised her most was not their entitlement, but their shock at her resistance. They had assumed abandonment made people weak. They had never considered that it might make them unbreakable. The tension reached a point where silence was no longer enough, where inaction became interpreted as defiance, where her refusal to comply threatened a hierarchy that had never considered her a variable. And yet, Nimra remained steady, not because she enjoyed conflict, but because she finally understood something essential. People who demand loyalty without ever offering protection do not deserve compliance. And family that appears only when something is owed is not family at all. The girl who had once been left behind now stood at the center of their discomfort, not as a victim of circumstance, but as the only person in the room with nothing to hide. The demands would continue. She knew that. But so would her resolve. Because survival had taught her the one lesson they never learned. You cannot take from someone who has already learned how to live without you. The moment Nimra decided to stop absorbing pressure quietly, something inside the situation shifted. Not outwardly, not yet, but at its core. She had spent years surviving by adapting, by staying small enough to avoid conflict. This time, she chose stillness with intention rather than fear. She drew the line privately before anyone else noticed. It began with clarity. Not emotional clarity, but structural clarity. She stopped engaging with vague conversations and indirect messages. She reduced communication to what was necessary and factual. Every interaction became deliberate. Every response carried weight because it was measured. This unsettled them more than anger ever could have. People who rely on emotional leverage expect reaction. They expect tears, explanations, resistance, or submission. What they did not expect was neutrality. Nimra's calm forced them to confront the reality that influence only works when the other person believes you have power. She no longer did. The legal framework surrounding the inheritance became her anchor. It was not personal. It was not reactive. It existed independent of anyone's feelings. The will did not bend under pressure, nostalgia, or manipulation. It stood. As understanding spread that there would be no easy access, the atmosphere hardened. Where politeness had failed, calculation took over. Where emotional appeals had collapsed, strategy emerged. They began to test boundaries. Not openly, never openly, but through implication, through reminders of obligation, through subtle suggestions of consequences that were never stated clearly enough to be challenged directly. Nimra recognized the pattern immediately. She had lived it before. This was the same behavior that had followed her abandonment, the same shifting responsibility, the same quiet insistence that discomfort was her fault for not accommodating others. The difference now was that she had distance, and distance created perspective. She refused to justify herself. Justification invites debate, and debate implies that others are entitled to weigh your choices. She owed them no such platform. Her uncle watched this shift with growing unease. The dynamic he had relied on, her silence, her compliance, her assumed fragility, no longer existed. The authority he had carried unchallenged began to erode, not because she attacked it, but because she did not acknowledge it. Authority unrecognized loses its power. The realization that Nimra would not be guided, influenced, or redirected struck harder than any refusal could have. It dismantled assumptions they had never questioned. They had believed her past made her dependent. Instead, it had made her autonomous. The legal confirmations arrived quietly, reinforcing what had already been written. There were no loopholes, no reinterpretations, no provisions for negotiation disguised as fairness. The intent was clear, and intent mattered. Nimra felt no triumph, only grounding. This was not about winning. It was about stability. It was about protecting the future she had built with no help and no safety net. The inheritance did not define her worth, but it represented acknowledgement long denied. That acknowledgement did not need permission to exist. As resistance met resistance, the emotional tone darkened. What had once been masked as concern now revealed frustration. Not with the situation, but with her refusal to play the role they had assigned. They had expected gratitude. They encountered autonomy. The weight of standing alone resurfaced, but it felt different now. Not like abandonment, but like choice. Nimra chose solitude over compromise that would cost her integrity. She chose peace over approval that came with conditions. The line she had drawn was invisible, but it was absolute. And once drawn, it could not be crossed. Because this time, Nimra was not the girl being left behind. She was the woman deciding who stayed. When control is lost, desperation follows. The shift was subtle at first, almost unnoticeable unless you had lived through it before. Nimra had. She recognized the signs not because they were dramatic, but because they were familiar. Pressure no longer sought her agreement. It sought her fear. The messages changed in rhythm. Not more frequent, but more deliberate. Carefully timed. Strategically placed. They arrived when she was least prepared, when silence would feel heavier than response. She did not respond. That was when implication replaced persuasion. Suddenly, her independence was framed as recklessness. Her restraint was painted as arrogance. The same qualities that had once been ignored were now reframed as flaws. People who had never contributed to her survival began questioning her judgment. They did not ask how she had endured. They questioned whether she deserved what she had been given. Nimra understood the tactic immediately. undermine confidence, create doubt, suggest instability without ever stating it outright. It was a way to destabilize without accountability, to threaten without evidence. She refused to internalize it. Years of solitude had taught her something critical. Opinions do not define reality unless you allow them to. And she had spent too long building her life to surrender it to people who appeared only when they wanted control. The uncle's distance collapsed into proximity, not physical but emotional. His presence felt heavier now, layered with expectation and disappointment. He did not confront her directly. He never had. Instead, he let implication do the work for him. She was expected to feel pressure. She felt clarity. Each attempt to intimidate her revealed how little power they truly held. They had influence only when she believed they mattered more than her own sense of self. They had none when she chose detachment. Legal boundaries held firm. That frustrated them most. Emotion could be manipulated. History could be rewritten. But documents did not respond to intimidation. The law did not bend for nostalgia or bloodlines. They were running out of options. Nimra sensed the turning point before it arrived. It came not as a threat, but as a shift in energy. Conversations ended abruptly. Responses grew colder. The warmth that had been manufactured disappeared entirely. She was no longer a relative to be convinced. She was an obstacle to be removed. That realization did not frighten her. It steadied her. She adjusted her routines. Not out of fear, but awareness. She kept records. She documented interactions. She trusted her instincts, the same instincts that had carried her through abandonment, uncertainty, and survival. Isolation returned, but this time, it was intentional. She understood now that protection did not always come from others. Sometimes it came from boundaries that refused to apologize for existing. The intimidation failed because it relied on a version of Nimra that no longer existed. The girl who had once been left behind might have folded. The woman standing now did not. And in that refusal, something irreversible occurred. The balance of power shifted completely. Because when fear no longer works, those who rely on it are exposed. The demand did not arrive suddenly. It had been forming for weeks, layered beneath pressure, implication, and intimidation. When it finally surfaced, it did so without shame, stripped of politeness and pretense. It was no longer about fairness. It was about surrender. Nimra recognized it immediately for what it was, a final attempt to reclaim control after every subtle strategy had failed. The language surrounding it was clean, almost reasonable, but the intention was unmistakable. They wanted access, authority, and compliance. Nothing less would satisfy them. What shocked her was not the demand itself. It was the certainty behind it. They truly believed she would give in. They believed that isolation would break her. That exhaustion would weaken her resolve. That being outnumbered would make her retreat. They underestimated how deeply independence had reshaped her. Nimra had lived without protection long enough to understand that peace does not come from avoiding conflict. It comes from refusing to be manipulated by it. The demand reframed her inheritance, not as a right, but as a temporary mistake that needed correction. It suggested oversight, guidance, and redistribution, all under the guise of responsibility. It assumed she lacked the maturity to decide for herself. That assumption sealed everything. Because for the first time, Nimra felt no hesitation, no doubt, no emotional pull, only certainty. She understood then that this was not about money, property, or legacy. It was about power, about a system that had excluded her when she was vulnerable and now sought to include her only to control her. She would not allow that rewrite. Her response was not immediate, but it was decisive. She escalated quietly, strategically. Not with confrontation, but with preparation. She strengthened every boundary, reinforced every safeguard, ensured every decision was documented, protected, and irreversible. She moved from defense to assertion. That shift changed everything. The moment she stopped reacting and started acting, the dynamic collapsed. They were no longer negotiating. They were facing consequences. The demand had crossed a line not because it was unreasonable, but because it revealed intent too clearly to ignore. There was no room left for misunderstanding. No space for reconciliation built on compromise. Nimra felt the weight of finality settle over her. Not sadness. Relief. The relief of knowing exactly where she stood. She had been abandoned once, without explanation or choice. This time, she was the one choosing distance with clarity, agency, and control. And those who had mistaken her silence for weakness were about to learn the cost of that mistake. Because when someone who survived without you finally says no, it is not a rejection. It is a boundary. And boundaries change outcomes. Truth does not arrive loudly. It does not announce itself or demand attention. Most of the time, it waits patiently, buried beneath assumptions and convenience, until the moment silence can no longer protect lies. For Nimra, that moment came quietly. It arrived not as a confrontation, but as confirmation. What she uncovered was not shocking because it was dramatic, but because it explained everything. Every absence, every delay, every carefully maintained distance that had shaped her life without ever being named. The documents had always existed. They had simply never been meant for her to see. In the process of securing her inheritance beyond dispute, Nimra encountered records that went beyond the will. Paper trails rarely lie. They do not carry emotion, only sequence. Dates. Transfers. Decisions. Patterns that, when viewed together, reveal intent. Her mother's departure was not sudden. It had been planned, not in panic or desperation, but with deliberation. Financial arrangements had been discussed months before Nimra was left behind. Responsibilities had been redirected quietly. Conversations had taken place in rooms where Nimra's name was spoken not with concern, but calculation. She had not been abandoned because her mother could not stay. She had been left because staying would have complicated things. That realization settled heavily, but it did not break her. Pain requires shock. This felt like alignment, like pieces falling into place after years of confusion. The uncle's role became clearer with every page. He had not been distant by accident. He had been strategically uninvolved. While Nimra struggled through instability and uncertainty, arrangements were being made that excluded her by design. Not to harm her directly, but to simplify outcomes. She had been inconvenient. And inconvenient people are often erased quietly rather than confronted openly. The inheritance itself was not an apology. It was a correction. The person who had written the will had seen what others pretended not to, had noticed the imbalance, had documented intention carefully, anticipating resistance, anticipating manipulation, anticipating exactly what was now unfolding. That foresight changed everything, because it meant Nimra was not an afterthought. She had been remembered. The truth destabilized the family in ways they could not contain. Their confidence began to fracture under the weight of exposure. Not publicly, not yet, but internally. The certainty they had relied on no longer held. They had assumed ignorance was permanent. They had assumed silence meant consent. They were wrong. Nimra did not reveal what she knew immediately. She observed. She watched how pressure continued even after safeguards were reinforced. How entitlement persisted despite clarity. How demands were framed as responsibility even when evidence contradicted their narrative. She realized then that truth alone does not change people. Timing does. And she waited. When the moment came, it did not explode. It collapsed. Legal acknowledgement of previously concealed arrangements surfaced quietly, stripping authority from those who had relied on it. The structure they had built to maintain control weakened, not because Nimra attacked it, but because it could no longer sustain scrutiny. The uncle's influence diminished rapidly. Not because Nimra challenged him directly, but because documentation did. Because accountability had finally entered the room, and it did not recognize hierarchy or bloodline. The family dynamic shifted in real time. Urgency replaced confidence. Silence replaced pressure. Where demands had once been firm, hesitation crept in. Where intimidation had once been implied, retreat became visible. They were not afraid of Nimra. They were afraid of what she now knew. The truth had turned the tables without her ever raising her voice. She felt no triumph in this. Only clarity. Clarity about who had protected her absence, who had benefited from it, who had mistaken her survival for ignorance. Most importantly, clarity about herself. She had not been strong because of what she was given. She had been strong because of what she endured. The girl who had once waited for explanations now understood that some truths do not come to comfort you. They come to free you. And freedom does not ask permission. By the time the dust began to settle, Nimra was no longer reacting to events. She was shaping outcomes. Not with revenge, but with finality. The truth had done what anger never could. It had removed their leverage. It had dismantled their narrative. It had restored balance where silence once allowed injustice to grow. And there was only one step left. Not confrontation. Not reconciliation. Closure. Closure did not arrive with celebration. It arrived quietly, the way peace often does when it has been earned rather than granted. For Nimra, the end of the conflict was not marked by apologies or sudden warmth. It was marked by distance, intentional, measured, and permanent. The pressure stopped. Not because understanding had been reached, but because leverage no longer existed. The people who had circled her life with entitlement retreated when they realized there was nothing left to take. Influence dissolved once it could no longer be disguised as concern. Nimra felt the absence immediately. And she welcomed it. She finalized what needed to be finalized. Not out of bitterness, but out of responsibility to herself. Every decision was rooted in stability, not emotion. The inheritance was secured, protected, and placed exactly where it belonged, in her control. What surprised her most was how little it changed her daily life. She did not suddenly feel whole. She did not feel validated by money or recognition. What changed was internal. For the first time since she was 16, her past no longer hovered unanswered. The silence that had once haunted her lost its power. It no longer asked questions. It no longer demanded explanations. It simply existed. And she existed beyond it. Nimra took time to reflect on what she had survived. The years of being overlooked. The weight of independence learned too early. The quiet resilience that had grown unnoticed by those who underestimated her. She realized something important. She had never needed them to become who she was. Their absence had shaped her, but it had not defined her. She chose what to keep carefully. She kept the stability she had built on her own. She kept the boundaries that had protected her peace. She kept the strength that came from knowing she could survive loss without losing herself. She did not keep resentment. She did not keep the need for acknowledgement. She did not keep the expectation that family must be forgiven simply because it exists. She let those go. The house, the inheritance, the legacy. It all mattered less than the freedom she felt walking forward unburdened. What once symbolized conflict now represented closure, not because it healed the past, but because it allowed her to stop carrying it. Nimra did not seek revenge. She did not seek reconciliation. She sought alignment. Alignment between who she had been forced to become and who she chose to be. The girl who had been left behind at 16 no longer waited for explanations. The woman she had become understood that some people enter your life to teach you self-reliance, not belonging. And that lesson, painful as it was, had given her something unbreakable. Agency. As her life settled into its next chapter, Nimra felt something unfamiliar but welcome. Lightness. Not because everything had been resolved perfectly, but because nothing unresolved still controlled her. The past had finally released its grip, not because it was forgiven but because it no longer mattered. She moved forward without looking back. Not in anger, not in grief, but in peace. Because in the end, what Nimra chose to keep was not what was left to her. It was herself. Nimra's story was never about inheritance or loss. It was about survival in silence, about growing strong where no one stayed to protect her. Being left behind at 16 taught her how to stand alone, but reclaiming her future taught her something even more powerful. Self-worth does not come from who claims you, but from who you choose to become. The people who once ignored her presence returned only when it benefited them, but by then, Nimra no longer needed validation, approval, or permission. She had already built a life on resilience, integrity, and quiet strength. In the end, she didn't win by taking something back. She won by refusing to be taken from again. And sometimes, that is the strongest ending of all.